Please.
It actually feels remarkably awkward. Sorry. Here. And I'll bounce around. So thanks for hosting me and letting me talk. I was for those of you that know what's going on in Denver this week. Denver Startup Week is happening all week. It's the third year of Denver Startup Week, which is a phenomenon that's now rolling out across the country. It started in Boulder 6 years ago. It was the first Boulder Startup Week. There have now been Austin and Seattle Startup Weeks. In terms of what I want to talk about tonight, it overlaps, I think it intersects nicely with this kind of incredible space that we're in, around the notion of creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship, and some of the dynamics around why it's so powerful to create environments that enable and encourage innovation and entrepreneurship in terms of our work and our society in general. To give some context for this, I started my first company in Boston when I was, I'm almost 49, so when I was 19, so almost 30 years ago. And that was a self-funded business, started by two guys, me and my partner, who knew nothing about business. And we were nerds, and we were into software, and we just started a business. And in 1993, that business had become a successful business. It got bought by a large public company. And I started at the time investing some of the money that I made while I was working for this large public company and other startups. And I found this phenomenal thing from the transition of my first company where I really felt very alone. All of a sudden, I found a whole bunch of other people who felt like my peers. They felt like my people in the notion of they were just starting something from scratch with no idea what they were doing, but with a vision of what they wanted to create and where they wanted to go with it. How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Better? The guys in the back sit down. That's good. So during this period of time, all of a sudden I started finding other people that were interested in creating something from nothing. And while within my company I understood that because many of the projects we did were obviously projects that started from nothing, the idea of creating entrepreneurial activity and businesses from nothing became very powerful to me. My wife and I moved to Boulder in 1995. She's from Alaska, I'm from Dallas, Texas, so Boston wasn't home and New England wasn't home. And when I sold my first company in 28, I told her that by the time I was 30, we'd be out of Boston. And about 2 months before I turned 30, she told me she was moving to Boulder and I could come with her if I wanted to. That's how we got to Boulder. And it was very much, we were married at the time, so it was kind of a pretty simple choice for me. And we came to Boulder. We've been to Colorado plenty, and we love the idea of Colorado. We both love the idea of open space, and lots of mountains and lots of room. And I had zero expectation of doing anything in Colorado in terms of business. One of the big attractions was that there was an airport. The idea just opened. There was an airport that was easy for me to get to either coast. All of my investments were on the various coasts. New York, Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And I was traveling back and forth across the country all the time, so I figured out, when I thought forward almost 20 years, a number of remarkable things have happened in Colorado around innovation and entrepreneurship, with a big focus on Boulder and Denver, but broadly around Colorado, that is starting to set a tone for a lot of other innovative activity throughout not just the US, but the world. The book that you get is a book called Startup Communities. It's a book I wrote a couple of years ago. And I used Boulder as the example of how to create a startup community in any city in the world. So there's been this long, sort of in tech world, this long, mildly annoying discussion about how if you really want to create a tech company, you have to get Silicon Valley. And the people in Boston and New York are very annoyed by that because it's not true. It sort of undermines the dynamic of those ecosystems. But there was this ongoing notion that you couldn't really build a vibrant entrepreneurial community in a 100,000 person town. Or in a Midwestern town, by the way, that's what people think of. Denver is Midwestern town, like Denver. And I just didn't accept that. I thought it made no sense. It wasn't linked to my experience because between 1995 and about 2010 when I started working on this book, I've been involved not just in investing in companies on either coast, but many, many companies in Colorado, including a number that have become very successful, many that have failed. That's the nature of entrepreneurship. But with entrepreneurs who are very resilient in terms of what they were doing. Another thing happened that was very interesting at about the same time, which if you remember, there was this thing in 2007 to 2009 called the global financial crisis. And apparently the world as we knew it was going to end. And governments would go bankrupt, countries would go bankrupt, every financial institution would need to be nationalized. And of course there was a gigantic economic shock and huge dislocation. But there was something really foundational that was going on in that time period when we reflect on it. If you think about the shift of our society over time and how business works over time, we went from an agricultural economy in the 1800s to an industrial economy around the turn of the century, early 1900s, middle, 1920, 1930, World War II, 1950. And around 1960, 1970, people started talking about an information economy. But an information society didn't really kick in until the 1980s, 1990s. And then there was this great promise in the 1990s around the internet of how technology was going to change everything. And we had this internet all collapse. And there was a lot of society, a lot of people in business were like, oh yeah, that was interesting, but it didn't really matter. But then what happened was we had this massive financial shock in 2008. And if you actually look at the technology companies and you take out these sort of couple of years of insanity between 1999 and 2001, the technology industry and the impact of technology on business and society has been on a very, very, very aggressive and steady march. Not just in terms of what it does, but how it impacts how we work. When you reflect back on how businesses are structured historically, we talk about the notion of a hierarchy, right? We think about hierarchies that have existed forever. Religion's a hierarchy, government's a hierarchy, military's a hierarchy. Hierarchies existed to get leverage from labor, right? So in industrial society, we created hierarchies to try to get leverage out of labor, which was us, humans. And even in business today, many large companies have hierarchies as their native organizational structure to get leverage out of the organization, communication chains, all of that. Think about an entrepreneurial business. When you think about a business that starts from nothing, those businesses actually often behave very differently, especially at the beginning. They behave much more like networks because you're using whatever resources you can find inside and outside your business to try to get things up and going. Now, the idea of a network is, does anybody here, when I say the word network, they're like, what are you talking about? We all have networks, right? We use Facebook, or we use LinkedIn, or we use Twitter. The notion of networks, social networks, using information technology, computers, or cell phones to connect each other, not on hierarchical ways, right? Not up and down hierarchy, but person to person, right? You want to reach me, my email is brad@feld.com, my Twitter handle is @Feld. Send me a note. Respond. You don't have to go for a gatekeeper. You don't have to ask permission of somebody. That's a network phenomenon that happens pretty quickly. That network phenomenon has been building for a very long time in a number of different industries, especially in technology, but around entrepreneurship in general. And my belief is that in 2008, 2009, we had the shift from the dominant form of building and managing organizations from hierarchy shifted to a network. That doesn't mean hierarchies go away. It doesn't mean that hierarchies don't have a reason to exist. But it means that when you start thinking about how to generate or create the next generation of companies and innovation and entrepreneurial activity, the network starts to dominate. Now, the reason that's so important is the way you gain power in a hierarchy is you traverse up the hierarchy, right? You do things, that hierarchy has a set of rules, and you have a boss, you have a set of objectives, and at some point you get promoted, and that gives you more power in the hierarchy. That's not how network works. Network works has nothing to do with the rules because they're messy, they're amorphous, they're constantly changing. We're each a node on a network, And there's a little bit of an illusion that the more links you have, the stronger, more powerful your node is, right? So if you have more friends on Twitter, or more followers on Twitter, or more Facebook friends, you're more important. Actually, it turns out that that's not true. That's only half the equation. It's not just the number of links that you have to other people on the network, both in and out of your node, but the activity across those links. What do you do with those interactions? And the more quality interactions you have across the network, the more significant your node is, the more power you have. So hierarchy, the way you about hierarchy is you do things that please your boss and your boss's boss, whatever your hierarchy are. Network, you do stuff. You contribute to other people in the network through the connections that you have. All right, hold that thought. So I took this and I started thinking about what caused Boulder in 2010, 2011, 2012 to be recognized internationally as one of the most vibrant startup communities anywhere. So when people were talking in 2011, 2012 about startups, but 2010, still nobody was really talking about startups and entrepreneurship. We're still sort of, the world is almost ending, but not quite. And all of these startups are just doing their thing. And they're becoming significant interesting businesses. And all of a sudden today, of course, it's very trendy and it's very front of mind. But in 2010, there was a thing that happened, which was President Obama announced something called Start America. And it was the first time our federal government used the phrase startup and entrepreneurship in the same construct. Up to that point, for our government, and for most government, the notion of a startup or entrepreneurship was a small business. And so we have this thing, it's not called the High Growth Entrepreneurship Administration, it's called the Small Business Administration. So nothing wrong with small business, but the whole frame of reference around innovation was that it was a uniform thing. There was no difference whether you were a local coffee shop or you were Facebook. And the local coffee shop started with 1 or 2 people, and mine now 5 or 10 people. And Facebook started with 4 people, very famously. And is now, or infamously, and is now, whatever, 10,000. So very different trajectories, very different needs, very different dynamics, but they were thought as the same thing. So in 2010, the language to talk about entrepreneurship and high-growth entrepreneurship is distinct from small business started to appear. All of a sudden, when people talk about startup communities, it used to be entrepreneurial ecosystems. The phrase startup communities was a phrase that emerged after I wrote this book and really pounded that phrase out for lots of people. The idea of startup communities, when you talk about it, people would start to say San Francisco, New York, Boston, Boulder. But which one is not like the other? Right? I mean, last time I checked, Boulder fits in like one building in downtown New York. The entire city fits in the building. Right? Or the Transamerica Tower could probably hold 100,000 people. So they're very, very different things. And when I started to try to understand is what happened in Boulder that caused this phenomenon. I came up with 4 principles, and I talk about them as the Boulder thesis. And these 4 principles have really become very enduring in lots of different dimensions. One dimension is this notion of creating a startup community in any city in the world. But another dimension is creating startup communities that don't necessarily have physical proximity. So they could be across certain industries or certain affinity groups. I'm seeing it being used within education, people trying to reinvent the way education works by talking about how can they use these principles around innovation there. I think fundamentally it comes back to this notion of creating environments where innovation happens.